What are some of dark events happened in history not many people know about? The Cadaver Synod. Basically the Pope had a previous Pope's corpse exhumed so the corpse could stand trial for something made up. So they dug up his bloated 7-month-old corpse and convicted him, retroactively nullifying his papacy. Then they dumped his bloated and convicted corpse in a river. The people got pissed and overthrew the Pope, who was strangled in prison. The next Pope came along and had the corpse collected from the river and its papacy posthumously reinstated. 897 was a crazy year. Once in the 70s, a film crew was filming an episode of The $6 Million Man. And they were shooting at an amusement park funhouse kind of thing. A stagehand was moving what he thought was a prop wax figure on a noose, only for one arm to fall off, revealing human flesh and bone underneath. After an autopsy, it was revealed to be the 60-something-year-old corpse of an old Wild West outlaw that had been taxidermied to an extent. Edit. Thanks for the award. A lot of Salmonella fans. Ha. The ideal maternity home here in Canada. From the 1920s till the 1940s. They took in babies from unwed mothers and they were selling them especially to desperate Jewish families in New Jersey. Adoption was illegal in the US back then. It was later discovered that the people who ran this business would starve the unmarketable babies by feeding them only molasses and water. The babies would last around 2 weeks on this diet. They put the corpses in wooden boxes often used for butter, and that's why the victims are called the butter box babies. The boxes were either buried on the property or at sea or burned in the home furnace. The parents who gave their child to this maternity home would go back and see how their child is doing, but were told the child has died when in fact it had been sold to adopting parents. Between 400 and 600 died in that home and at least 1,000 were adopted, but sadly, the adopted babies often suffered from diseases because of the unsanitary conditions and lack of care at the home. During Prohibition, the government funded and led an operation to release barrels of alcohol that they had poisoned to make people sick and shy away from bootleg liquor. Lots of people ended up dying, but people still drank more than ever. The Halifax explosion. Regarded by many as the biggest man-made explosion prior to the invention of the atomic bomb. A ship laden with explosives collided with another vessel in Halifax Harbor. The resulting explosion flattened much of the city's downtown core, killing roughly 2,000 and injuring 9,000. The blast is said to have temporarily displaced the water in the harbor, forming a tsunami that reached up to 15 meters high, surging over the wreckage of the waterfront. The following day, Halifax was hit by a blizzard that dumped 40 centimeters of snow on top of the city, further complicating rescue efforts. The city is also home to a cemetery where many victims of the Titanic were laid to rest. It is said that the body identification system developed at the time of the Titanic sinking in 1912 aided efforts to identify victims of the Halifax explosion in 1917. There's a surprising amount of people that don't know about the Rwanda genocide that happened pretty recently, like when Bill Clinton was president. Basically there were two types of Rwanda natives. The Hutus and Tutsis. The Hutus believed the Tutsis were invaders of land that was theirs. And after the assassination of the Rwandan leader, who was a Hutu, the Hutus were ordered to chop down the tall trees, which meant kill the Tutsis. The differences between Hutus and Tutsis were that Hutus were supposedly darker skinned, shorter in stature, and had shorter faces. That's why the Tutsis were called tall trees. The events that followed killed so many Tutsis. Yet the UN was stingy to call it a genocide. They never liked using that term because of its association with World War II and the Nazis. It wasn't until very recently that the killing stopped. To this day, Hutus and Tutsis that survived the genocide speak at events side by side, speaking about how terrible the events were. In the 1920s, the Osage Indians, Oklahoma, USA, discovered one of the largest oil fields on Earth. They went from being poor to being the richest civilization on Earth overnight. Imagine Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Elon Musk living on the same street. The Osage were building mansions, hiring servants, driving exotic cars. And the women were marrying white men as trophy husbands. It wasn't long before people started moving into town and exploiting them. Slowly, one by one, they began being murdered. By the end, hundreds had died. The men were hiring people to kill their wives. Lawyers were drawing contracts to transfer oil rights and tricking the Osage into signing them. It was so crazy that it led to the birth of the FBI. This was one of their original investigations, and is still largely unsolved. Martin Scorsese is currently directing a movie about it. It's going to be based on the book Killers of the Flower Moon, which is where I learned about it. Super interesting read. The sad case of Ota Benga. He was a pygmy boy from the Congo who was essentially captured and brought to the USA to be displayed in freak shows. He had undergone tribal customs such as having his teeth filed into points before his capture. He eventually got out of the carnivals and dreamed of returning to Africa. Then World War I happened, making the trip impossible for the foreseeable future. He committed suicide by gunshot. In my family's region in Africa, they used to carry out the death penalty by snakebite. Just a snakebite to each ankle. And then letting the man spend his remaining time with his family before he died, under supervision. I thought it sounded sort of humane in a way. Like our lethal injections. The Radium Girls. In the 1920s. They worked at a watch company painting the hours on the watches using radium. A radioactive element that glows in the dark. They did this with no PPE and weren't told radium is dangerous. Meanwhile, the chemists had full PPE and worked in a sealed environment. Worse, they were instructed to lick the tip of the brush to make a very fine point. Some of them would paint their nails or their teeth with it for fun when they went out at night. They would develop cancer whenever the paint touched. And many of them had such decay in their jaws that their mandibles had to be held on with bandages. Edit. Apparently there's a new movie about this, as many redditors have helpfully pointed out. The Massacre of Kalavrita. It is a village in Greece. The Germans entered it and rounded up all the male villagers in a field. They then shot them all with machine guns. After that they got the children and women and put them in the church. When everyone was inside, they locked the doors and set fire to the church. Around 20 minutes into the burning, a German soldier couldn't take it anymore and opened the doors. Around half of the people escaped the fire, but the rest perished. The German soldier was shot for this. And if you go to Kalavrita today, his name is on the memorial. No one was punished for this apart from the leader of the division, who I was told by my grandmother that he died in a gulag. But everyone else got away with it. It is sad that no one knows about this, as things like this happened all over Greece and Russia and Poland. I only know about this because my great grandmother was one who escaped in the church. This massacre was in retaliation for the villagers supporting the local resistance force, which had recently killed about 10 Nazis. Kakikai, or the chicken poop prison in Thailand. Used by French forces to hold political prisoners, rebellious Thai people, in the Chanthaburi region. The long-standing impacts of this much-feared torture are still felt in the region today. There's a Thai saying for those who buck authority that roughly translates to be careful not to get caught in a chicken poop prison. I learned about this prison from my parents, who learned about it from theirs. How it worked was there was a small, 2-story prison. Bottom floor houses the prisoners, and the top floor is basically a huge chicken cooperative. The grated floor ceiling ensures that the chicken poop falls onto the prisoners below. Apparently, even though the maximum sentence in Kakikai was around a week, it was one of the most feared punishments there was. As someone who has cleaned out chicken coops before, that's f***ing horrific. The stench is insane and definitely toxic. Croatia's Ustachas. Sick radical mothurfkas. An Ustacha that isn't able to take out a baby from its mother's womb with a blade isn't a good Ustacha. Anti-Pavelic. Some of their most horrific crimes were burning babies in front of their parents, mangling kids from 0-14 with axes, arping girls in front of their mothers, cutting off the ears and noses of their prisoners while being alive. Even the Nazis were horrified by these guys' methods. Highland clearances. Thousands of Scots were forcibly evicted from their homes. Many were forcibly exported to Canada, the US or Australia. Many who refused were massacred with whole villages of women and children raped. Many died of starvation on the forced marches or from famine. Also they could farm sheep. The Cambodian genocide. You could have been killed just for wearing glasses. Therefore being an intellectual. At least this was the Khmer Rouge logic. The prisoners were tortured so badly that they tried to commit suicide in every possible way. Even by using some spoons. The executions used to be like this. The prisoners were put on a straight line and to the second prisoner was given an object like a shovel or a hammer which he had to use to kill the prisoner in front of him. Then, the same object was given to the third prisoners and the cycle would repeat until there was nobody alive except for the last prisoner on the line, who was then killed by the guards. Since many medics were killed or sent to work as farmers, the local regime used child medics to conduct experiments on the prisoners. They used teenagers with no knowledge of Western medicine to experiment on people without anesthesia. For example, they opened one person's chest just to see his heart beating. Imho. This shit is even worse than Unit 731. The January 1945 sinking of the MV Wilhelm Gustloff. It was a German ship carrying fleeing Germans from the Eastern Front to the west through the Baltic Sea. It was sunk by the Soviet Navy shortly after setting sail. The total death toll is unknown but estimated at over 9,000 since there were so many stowaways. It is the worst maritime disaster ever. Several times more than the Titanic. It didn't get nearly the press because they were the enemy, so who cares? And the Nazi media certainly didn't report it because they're at the waning days of a war they're badly losing, so the last thing they need is more hits to their already sinking morale. You know Jameson whiskey? Well, a long ass time ago in like the 19th, one of their family heirs fed a little girl to cannibals. Like legit went and bought a little girl in the Congo as a slave and brought her up to a cannibal tribe because he wanted to see them. Sick FCK drew pictures of it and shit as it was happening. Of course for years the family tried to bury the fact. And the stories and such. Discredit the witnesses. But the crazy bastard was happy to document the whole thing. His only rebuttal in case it reflected badly on him was that he wanted to see if they would do it. And his accounts matched up with the evidence witnesses had provided. Edit. Really lads? 2 wholesome awards? You didn't think a cute puppy or kitten deserved those accolades more? The French army also poured napalm on Algerians. But with more luck. No journalists. No camera. Just a few confessions from pilots. The Arpay of Nanking. Some of the things I have read have made me physically sick. Not many people outside of Canada know about the abusive residential schools many indigenous kids were forced to go to up until the 90s. But even less know that many were also experimented on in the quest to cure tuberculosis. Truly sick stuff. The Chinese genocide in Mexico. It might be commonly known, but the My Lai massacre. Like most atrocities that happened in American history, the California genocide was never taught in school. It's about the killing of native Indians during the gold rush in California. I didn't learn about it until after college. And Governor Newsom finally made some type of apology maybe last year or the year before. The United Fruit Company's crimes in Latin America. They perpetrated massacres, slave labor, overthrew governments and generally just ravaged each country they stepped foot in. They left when the soil was dry and no longer efficient, leaving millions out of work, destabilized governments and still continued to extort locals for years later. It is absolutely disgusting what they did. I encourage everyone to read about it. Nanjing Massacre, the most largest massacre in China during the Republican era. Japanese army killed an estimated of 40,000 to over 300,000. The Japanese killed and arped many of the people. Many soldiers went beyond arpade to disembowel women. slice off their breasts, and nail them alive to walls. Fathers were forced to pay their daughters, and sons their mothers, as other family members watched. Not only did live burials, castration, the carving of organs, and the roasting of people become routine, but more diabolical tortures were practiced, such as hanging people by their tongues on iron hooks or burying people to their waists and watching them get torn apart by German shepherds. So sickening was the spectacle that even Nazis in the city were horrified, one proclaiming the massacre to be the work of bestial machinery. Till this day, the memory of the Nanjing massacre has been a point of contention in Sino-Japanese relations. The US has a history of abusing Puerto Rico, so they put a gag law out on our anthem and flag. Massacred a peaceful holiday parade what wasn't even political in nature. Ponce Massacre. They also bombed the town of Jawa. At one point used our women to test a birth control pill. Something like 1/3 of them were sterilized. And held the independence leader in a cell where he was subjected to radiation poisoning. During the pre-Civil War era, slave masters would pay female slaves and force male slaves to pay them as well, in the name of breeding more slaves. If they became infertile, they brought in doctors to make them fertile again, by any means necessary. These doctors assumed that black women had high pain tolerance. Tuskegee syphilis study. Well, in 1832 Spanish troops landed on Puerto Rico and raped, pillaged and destroyed a native tribe called Taínos. Learned about the tribe when we found out my husband's great times 9 grandfather was a chief that had 1 wife and 12 kids, all who survived to adulthood. The Rohingya genocide. Towards the end of the Second World War, a Japanese POW camp called Sandakan forced 400 Allied prisoners on a death march across Borneo. The marches were so brutal that 6 of those 400 men survived, each of whom eventually went insane when they returned home. The single worst atrocity suffered by Australian servicemen is also one of the least known. The Opium Wars in Hong Kong. Absolute insanity that is not being taught in British schools at all. Conveniently pretending it didn't happen. Wish Britain would at least support Hong Kong now instead of looking the other way. Unit 731. A Japanese unit during World War II who carried out extremely gruesome and lethal experiments on humans, including but not limited to vivisection without anesthesia, exposure to biological agents, testing weapon lethality, sleep, food, water deprivation, extreme radioactivity exposure, low pressure chambers, burns, electrocutions, spinning to death in a centrifuge, injected with animal blood and seawater, forced frostbite, forced incestuous relationships, RPA and forced pregnancies, etc. ad nauseam. General MacArthur offered the physicians and the leader of the unit immunity in exchange for the information gleaned from the unit's wicked evils. William Ellison Jr. He was one of the few black slave owners in the American South. You read that very much correctly. It's like greed, lack of empathy, and opportunism is a human thing more than something exclusive from any race. If I recall correctly, the first step of the slave trade was black warlords, chiefs in Africa bringing slaves to be sold at the coastal cities. Well, happening right now. Live human organ harvesting and concentration camps going on in China. This more relatively unknown target than actually unknown, but everyone's heard of the Holocaust. But many people don't know of the Holodomor. It was a Soviet-carried genocide on Ukrainians who wanted independence, forcing a famine on them as they stole most of their food production. This isn't all of it nor the best explanation, but you should search it up. People should know more about this tragic event. In ancient China, Empress Elle and Empress Wu were both insanely brutal. In China at that time, being female was considered to be a disability pretty much, so they would be extra cruel to make up for it. I can't remember which is which, but both of them were consorts who wanted to take the place of the emperor's main wife. So they tricked them into doing things that made them look bad to get them out of the way. After that, One of the empresses cut the hands and feet off of the displaced wife, blinded her, and threw her into a dark pit full of pig's tea and made her crawl around looking for food until she starved to death. The other empress surgically cut the arms and legs off of the displaced wife and then threw her in a vat of wine and let her drown. I had to put my history book down after that part. The California missions were basically slave plantations run as religious institutions. Many of them sit near or next to active cemeteries which were mass graves prior to their sanctioning. Because the land is owned by the Roman Catholic Church or holds some form of historical designation, there's little to no chance thousands of indigenous slaves will ever be recognized or repatriated. Entire black communities and their properties were destroyed or wiped out because white Americans did not want them living near them and worked themselves into a riotous frenzy. Redlining and racist housing regulations developed by state governments are some of the key factors as to why black Americans have not accumulated wealth in this country. They have lost generations of wealth because of these rules, even as they were eventually outlawed. Child marriage in America isn't talked about as much as it should be. What's worse is that it's still a thing. What's even worse is that a Girl Scout tried to have it abolished but a bunch of old men blocked the bill. During the Somalia War in their 90s, member of Canada's Armed Forces Airborne Unit captured and tortured a black teenager, including sodomizing the boy. So anyone interested in history are aware that India had a very radical caste-based system in its villages. So in many villages the wealthy man of the village would have lot of interfering to do with village matters. One of which is, the first night of any newlywed lower caste bride would be spent with him.